You are listening to Viewpoints from PlaceCloud. Cultural researchers tell stories of places from around the world. For the full multimedia experience and to support the creators you enjoy, visit placecloud.io.
We're in the town of Middelburg, at the location of the West India House, once the home of the offices of the Zeeland Chamber of the Dutch West India Company. The current building houses a fancy stroopwafel store. But before we get to Middelburg, first something about slavery in Holland. On the face of it, the consideration that you have to judge people by the standards of their time seems to hold merit. We today like to consider ourselves more morally mature than our forefathers of hundreds of years ago, or even compared to those of the first half of the previous century. It's a consideration that often hovers on the sidelines when discussing slavery. Yet, typical for the European colonizing nations, slavery was completely or mostly illegal in the home countries, while allowed or even deemed necessary in the colonies. Before the Synod of Dordrecht of 1618 in the Netherlands, there was no legal nor theological stance on the practice of slavery and slave trade within the United Dutch provinces. Merchants coming into the different port cities of the Dutch Republic with slaves caused upheaval, as the consensus understood that slavery was not practiced in the Netherlands due to the free soil tradition, meaning those stepping foot on Dutch soil would automatically be relieved from their position as slave. Fascinatingly, the father of international law, the Dutchman Hugo Grotius, introduced the innovation that natural rights could be applied not only to individuals and states, but also to private entities, such as the Dutch chartered companies. In doing so, he provided a legal concession for these companies to confiscate Portuguese property under the premise of defensive war. Hence, Portuguese slave ports and slave systems became property of the West and East India Companies when conquering Portuguese possessions. This sounds eerily familiar to today's practices, particularly in the US, where companies have rights comparable to people. The concept of free soil held pretty well in Holland. In 1596, a Dutch vessel arrived at the port of Middelburg with over 100 Africans, where the owner wanted to set up a slave market for his cargo. However, local authorities declared the men, women and children to be free. Though in this case, after an appeal by the owner, he was allowed to leave with his cargo, re-enslaving them. Still, the East India Company forbade owners from bringing their slaves to the Netherlands in 1636. So there was a clear distinction in how slavery was handled in the colonies and at home. It appears that the Dutch and other colonizers of the time were in fact not that morally backwards. They just deemed it inappropriate for those that benefited from slavery to be confronted with the origins of the wealth that flowed into their coffers. In the Western Hemisphere, after being cut off from trade with Brazil by the Spanish king, the Dutch had slowly gained ground in replacing the Portuguese as colonial masters, both on the African west coast and in South America. In 1641, the Dutch West India Company had taken control of what is today Luanda, the capital of Angola, this with the help of the Count of Sonho, now in northern Angola. Then in 1643, Dom Miguel de Castro, a cousin of the Count, traveled to Holland via Dutch Brazil to ask for mediation in a conflict with King Garcia II of Congo, who also had sent an emissary to the Dutch. In Brazil, the Governor-General, John Maurice de Nassau-Siegen, received Miguel, who gave him and his retinue European clothes, before Miguel continued to Flushing, in Holland, where he was received by 3 directors of the Zeeland Chamber of the West India Company. Miguel stayed in Middelburg for 2 weeks, possibly at the offices of the Zeeland Chamber of the West India Company, where we are now, during which the directors ordered 6 paintings from a local painter, comprising 2 portraits of Dom Miguel de Castro and 1 portrait each of both his servants. one painting in Portuguese clothes and a full-length painting in Congolese dress. Miguel asked to take home one of the portraits, presumably the one in which he is shown in his personal attire. The one in Portuguese clothes remained in Holland and was given to Maurice de Nassau on his return, who eventually gave it to King Frederick II of Denmark, which is why this and two of the paintings of his servants can today be found at the Statens Museum voor Kunst in Copenhagen. After Middelburg, Miguel continued on to The Hague, where he met the stadtholder Frederick Henry. Miguel was likely seeking an alliance and support, perhaps with the Dutch state, perhaps with the West India Company, but no records are known that detail the meeting with the Dutch head of state. However, nothing structural seems to have come of the encounter, perhaps because he, Miguel, didn't bring any gifts to convince the Dutch dignitaries. That is to say, Miguel did bring gifts, but it seems he had left them behind in Brazil, with Maurice de Nassau, 200 slaves ending up in the pocket of, so it seems, the Dutch Governor-General. One can imagine that Nassau convinced Miguel that he wouldn't be able to take his cargo to Holland, as the 200 slaves would have been set free upon arrival due to the free soil doctrine, and certainly would have been inconvenient and meaningless to the Dutch stadtholder. Nassau's gift of a bunch of clothes for the Congolese emissary seems to have been a trade immensely beneficial to the German count. The price of a slave in the Dutch colony was not fixed. A low estimate would be around 100 guilders. A skilled craftsman in Holland would make around 250 guilders per year, so this means that Miguel's gift in today's terms might have been worth around 4 million euros. Miguel was said to be wearing Portuguese clothes in Holland, not Dutch clothes, so perhaps Nassau had even gotten his gift from some poor underling or a second-hand store. The Dutch slave trade was abolished in June 1814 by royal decree of William I, the first actual Dutch king of the Netherlands. In Suriname and the Dutch Antilles, slavery was abolished in 1863, though former slaves were required to keep working on their plantations for an additional 10 years. And in parts of the Dutch East Indies, slavery was only abolished on March 31, 1910. One rule for thee, it appears, another for me.